The movement for the acceptance of trans people has gathered quite some momentum in recent years. Although some of its claims are based on a concern for human rights and on a minimal ethics of the kind articulated, for instance, by John Stuart Mill and French philosopher Reuven Ogien, other claims are much more ambitious and sweeping. My guest for this episode, Spencer J. Case, has spent quite some time thinking about the notions of gender, gender identity, and other ideas without which some claims of the movement cannot be articulated. Spencer explains how activists and scholars have worked to make open and reasoned discussion of some of these claims out of the question in academic philosophy. So hi everyone, I'm delighted to welcome Spencer J. Case back to the podcast. Spencer, thanks for coming on again.
Thanks for having me back.
Well, a pleasure to have you again. So you just to inform the audience, the part of the audience that hasn't listened to our previous conversation with Matthew, you're a philosopher at the University of Colorado, and maybe that changed in the meantime.
Well, I'm sort of in transition right now. That's right. I got an international research fellowship at Wuhan University in China. There have been
Yes.
some complications with getting my visa, perhaps due in part to the political situation between the U.S. and China now. But I hope to be taking my position there in the next few weeks and researching metaethics.
Wow. Okay. Okay. So that's an interesting update. In any case, you obtained your PhD last year in 2018, and the title of your dissertation was From Epistemic to Moral Realism, the Defense of Ethical Truth. You are a contributor for Quillette, Org Digital, the National Review, and other magazines. And we had a recent discussion on leaving one's religion with Matthew Davis, who's one of our regular contributors on the podcast. So in this interview today, we will discuss a very different topic. We will focus on trans activism and its relationship with academic philosophy. So you've read and written quite a bit on the topic, and you describe the evolution of the relationship between trans activism and academia as follows. So here I will just quote you. In the space of about 20 years, the claims of the transgender rights movement have gone from being so radical that they were not widely discussed to being so orthodox, at least within academia, as to be considered beyond dispute. So we should probably state from the outset, I think it's very important, that the trans rights movement or trans activism, it's a movement, a political movement, which is not equivalent to the whole of the trans demographic, although of course there is some overlap.
Yeah, that's certainly true.
Yeah. So I think it's good to start from the controversy around this article in the journal Hypatia. This is one of the most salient events in this sort of long-lasting and sort of still progressing controversy. So Hypatia is a feminist philosophy academic journal. It's well regarded in the fields of philosophy and gender studies. And to introduce this controversy, I can again simply quote verbatim from your Quillette article. So you said that in its most recent issue, so this was in the spring of 2017, at the time you wrote this, the feminist philosophy journal Hypatia published an article by Rebecca Tuvel entitled In Defense of Transracialism. Tuvel, an untenured philosopher at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee, argues that, quote, considerations that support transgenderism extend to transracialism. So could you, make this this claim maybe a bit easier to comprehend for the audience?
Right. So Rebecca Tuvel was motivated in part by sympathy with a woman named Rachel Dolezal. You might recall that this was a big controversy back in 2015. This was a woman who was white by birth, but who wanted to transition to being Black, and actually had quite significant ties to African American culture. I believe she had two husbands who were African American, and she had, I believe, four African American adopted brothers or half brothers or something. I'm not sure exactly, but she had spent most of her life closely related to Black people and identified as African American herself. But this caused an outrage, and she was told that, you know, you don't get to choose your race, basically. Tuvel had sympathy for this person and wanted to know if we're going to allow people to transition from one gender to another, from male to female, or from man to woman, woman to man, it isn't quite clear why we shouldn't allow this in the racial case. And so she wrote an article basically just drawing out that analogy and considering some objections to it.
And so how did she argue this case? I mean, of course, you've already given I suppose the main argument, which is just an argument by analogy, so to say. But in slightly more detail, do you know what was the content of the paper?
But to be honest, it's been a while since I've read the paper very closely and in detail. I just went back and reread my own comments on the
Okay.
issue. But basically, if both things are social constructs, it's hard to see what would block the analogy, right? I mean, you could
Right.
block the analogy by being a race realist and saying that gender is a social construct, but race is biologically real. But the people who are pro-trans are unlikely to adopt racial realism, to say the least, right? They don't want to touch that with a 39.5-foot pole. So it's hard to see what would block the inference. And she does consider a number of things,
Right.
but they seem pretty feeble to me and to her as well.
Okay. And I mean, what's probably more important is to consider the reactions to the article, because this article got published, right, in Hypatia.
Yes, it did.
And then there was quite a strong reaction from within philosophy and I suppose other academic fields.
Right. And I don't think it actually began within philosophy. I think it actually began with academics in other fields. Tuvel herself sent me a Facebook message that with a link to a blog called Butterflies and Wills, I believe, that has screenshots of the moment that this whole backlash against her began, right after the article appeared. And it's really amazing to see how this whole thing started. There was somebody named, I believe, Zoe Samudzi, the first person to post on Facebook about this, totally outraged by the article, but also asking if anyone had a PDF of it, hadn't read it apparently. And there was this massive pile on, like, we need to take action. We need to take action. Somebody said we need to get Rhodes involved, meaning Rhodes College, where she's a professor, apparently trying to trigger some sort of administrative action that didn't materialize, as far as I know. The people were talking about we need reparations. Reparations. That word came up in this thread, and it ended.
Wow.
It culminated in somebody saying, "Let's get this person fired." And you can see the screenshots of all of this. It was all public, and you can see it at the blog, Butterflies and Wheels. I don't know if that's a reference to Mary Midgley, who said that debating Richard Dawkins would be like breaking a butterfly upon the wheel. I don't know if that's a reference to that. But anyway, you can find the screenshots of how this began. But anyway, within not very much time at all, there was this petition that garnered 500 names, and then eventually it got over 800 names. Mostly not well-known philosophers, a few names I recognized, but expressing total outrage over the article and giving a number of criticisms of the article, some of which were found by Justin Weinberg, who runs the Daily News blog. It's certainly not a friend of the gender critical side of things. And then also by Jesse Singal of the New York Review of Books. They found that some of these claims were not factual, or at least were very arguable. And so it seemed to be very hastily written. And nonetheless, it garnered a bunch of names. And what was more amazing still is that there was a post on the Facebook page of the journal Hypatia that appeared shortly after this, offering a sort of groveling apology on behalf of the majority of the board of associate editors of Hypatia. I don't believe it went so far as to demand retraction, but it did say that clearly the article shouldn't have been published, and we're sorry about all the harm that we've caused. And at that point, there was a massive reaction against the Hypatia journal for what they were doing with this. And philosophers were outraged, and Sally Scholes stepped in. She was editor-in-chief of Hypatia at the time. She said she did not approve of that apology, and she stood by the article. So the article was never actually retracted. Tuvel, by the way, while this was all going on, was subject to really horrible harassment. She was called all sorts of horrible names online. This is a person who has social anxiety, so we should take that into account. And what is most despicable about this, I think, is 2 members of her dissertation committee signed this letter denouncing her work and her by implication.
Yeah, I remember this detail, very striking detail. And I mean, why exactly were these academics offended, so to say, by the article? Is it because they didn't like the idea of transracialism because it might be connected to cultural appropriation or something like that? Or is it rather that they didn't like the way she treated or she discussed transgenderism, or is it both, or is it depends on the specific individual?
Well, there are a couple of different things here. One is, what do I think motivated them? And the other is, what do they say motivated them?
Okay.
I know you're supposed to be charitable and assume sincerity.
Yes.
But I have to say there are a number of things about this whole episode where I question the sincerity of some of the people involved. And sometimes I doubt whether their claimed motives were their actual motives, right?
Okay. Well, maybe we can start by stating what were the claimed motives.
Okay. So there were a couple of things that were found just not to be factual. Like, one of them was allegedly she had misstated Charles Mill's views on something, which this is one of the things Singal and Weinberg looked into and just said, no, that's just not true. But there were 2 things that they did object to that are worth discussing. And so one of them was she had dead named, which means she had used the prior transition name of a trans person, and it was Caitlyn Jenner. And it was simply that she noted that Caitlyn was once known as Bruce. Now, I think this is worth an excursion onto the whole subject of dead naming, if that seems appropriate to you.
For sure.
So I think there is a legitimate grain of truth here about this issue of dead naming, which is, if you transition to a new identity that's important to you and I follow you around and call you by your previous name, that's a form of harassment. That's bad behavior. We shouldn't condone it. And you can think of where this would be bad behavior even in unrelated to the trans movement, right? So like, I have a friend who joined a religious order and took a new name as a result of that. And if I, kept refusing to acknowledge this decision and calling him by his, baptismal name, his prior name, I think that would be harassment.
Right.
However, I find it very strange to use this word dead naming, which sounds so sinister, to apply to contexts where we're talking about something that's completely innocent, right? Or at least you would need to make a case that there's something wrong here. And I think that Rebecca Tuvel just wanted to mention the fact that Caitlyn had transitioned. And this is well known. This is on Caitlyn Jenner's Wikipedia page.
Right.
Caitlyn Jenner does not object to being having Bruce referred to in certain contexts, from what I've been able to find on the internet. It's just hard to believe that this sort of thing would be responsible for this kind of outrage. I mean, maybe you might say that the issue of dead naming generally is so important that we should just get out of the habit of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
But I even find this a little bit puzzling as to why, right? So I think if you want to really affirm Caitlin's narrative, a part of her narrative is that she was once Bruce, right? That's why she's not a cis woman. Like, why is she a trans woman? Because she had a prior male identity. So why is it that we may not speak of this prior identity, right?
Right.
Similarly, like in another context, I think the biblical Paul was once Saul, and it's central to his story
Mm-hmm.
that he was once Saul and persecuted Christians. And so I really don't see what's disrespectful about this.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't. And there are people who say that hearing their prior name causes a sense of dysphoria, and that might be a reason to be cautious about it. But that doesn't mean that there are never contexts in which it's appropriate to do, right? When it's legitimate information that you need to get across or it's helpful for communication. I found an article in HuffPost from about a month before the Hypatia affair began that objected to journalists dead naming women who had been murdered,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, so murdered trans women, and mentioning that they had been born and had grown up maybe with a different name or with a different identity. And I read that and I just thought, wait a minute, if I've had some friend from high school who's transitioned and taken a different name and he's been murdered, that's information I want to know.
Oh.
Uh, so I have to say I don't really understand
Mm-hmm.
the kind of moral panic around dead naming,
Right.
although there is a narrower kind of harassment that we should be concerned about, but this seems to go well beyond it.
Yeah, it's very relevant to make the distinction and to discuss it in such detail. So these are some of the objections, right, that were made to the article. Are there any others that you would like to cover in more depth?
Yeah, and I should say that Tuvel actually did modify the article. I think it was on May 4th, like it came out at the end of April. Not long after this, she modified the article to remove the reference to Bruce Jenner. So she's tried to be conciliatory there.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The other one, and this is the one you still hear, is that she did not engage the literature, or she did not adequately engage the literature. I also think this is a big nothing burger.
Mm-hmm.
I heard a lot, I saw on blogs and stuff, a lot of people critical of Tuvel were saying, like, look, as a philosopher, it's your job to engage the literature. And I just think nonsense. As a philosopher, your job is to give interesting arguments that help us get at the truth about fundamental questions that we care about. And if the literature doesn't help you do that, then so much the worse for the literature, right?
Mm-hmm.
If there's really a devastating objection that she did not address, why not raise that objection? Why not say, like, here's the refutation?
Mm-hmm.
Don't say, well, you didn't engage the literature. Unless there's some specific thing in the literature that you've got an obligation to engage, then I don't think that complaint has legs.
Right.
She did, by the way, cite over 20 articles and consider 4 or 5 objections in her article, depending on how you individuate them. And I want to know how many more objections she had to address before this would count as scholarly, how many more citations would she need, how much more engagement.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I have to say, I do doubt the sincerity of this, because it's hard to believe that if she had made the paper longer and considered more of the literature and still come down with the same conclusions in the end, that this would not have provoked exactly the same response. I find that hard to believe. And I should also say, I have this background set of beliefs about citation, and I think that we're forced to cite much more than we should for good philosophy. We tend to overcite. We tend to cite things for prudential reasons, like to show the editor that you've done your homework, right?
Mm-hmm.
The editor might not be an expert in the field, and you just want to really make it clear that you've done all of your reading. And that's a sort of thing that it might be prudentially useful, but it doesn't make for better philosophy papers. If you go back and look at really classic philosophy papers like W.K. Clifford's The Ethics of Belief, or the wonderful essays in Thomas Nagel's Moral Questions, you don't see them citing the literature to death. You don't see it. That's something I think we do more now, and it doesn't make the actual argumentation better. If you want a lit review, do a lit review. But I think there's too much of trying to prove, also citing stuff
Mm-hmm.
just for the hopes that you'll cite one of your referees and he or she will be more likely to approve it. I don't think that makes for better philosophy. So basically, I just think there are a variety of reasons to think that this "you didn't engage the literature" thing is a big nothing burger.
Mm-hmm. Do you think this objection might be connected to the common practice, in my understanding, that there is in some sectors of academia, usually the sort of postmodern social justice sectors, to draw extremely heavily on reference to other scholars and praising other scholars for the sort of the bravery of their work, and also referencing often very obscure texts. These are, I guess, two different practices, but that often combine in this sort of academic texts.
I mean, I do think that there's something insular about the literature,
Right, yeah.
and that this
Mm-hmm.
might be seen as a kind of, I don't know, rent seeking, or we have a monopoly on the literature. We're not going to let any new ideas on this topic come in. If we will be the gatekeepers of what gets to be said about this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And nobody quite comes out and says that.
Right.
But they come pretty close in a number of places that I found.
Okay. Yeah, I see. Any other claims that the critics of the article made that you would like to address?
Not really. I mean, I think that's basically it.
Okay.
And the only thing maybe more that needs to be said about this is unpacking what precisely is meant, what really lies behind the whole "you didn't engage the literature" complaint.
Mm.
I think here is where things get pretty revealing. Let me read for you from this one article that appeared in the Journal of the American Philosophical Association, fall 2017, after the Hypatia affair. This is by Professor Asta. It's just Asta. She apparently goes by only one name because she's Icelandic, and in Iceland, I guess there are some unusual naming conventions,
Mm-hmm.
so it's easier for her to just go by the one name. She's a professor at San Francisco State University,
Okay.
and was on the board of associate editors of Hypatia at the time the whole scandal went down.
Mm.
And so this is an article
All right.
where she reflects on the Hypatia affair and her own commitments as a feminist philosopher in light of that. I think it's quite interesting.
Mm-hmm.
She says that initially she thought this was a good article, but then she heard from the outrage of the backlash against the article, and then she came to see how this constituted a kind of betrayal
Okay.
of the community to whom she is accountable. So she asked this question: so who are we feminist philosophers, including feminist metaphysicians, accountable to? And then she goes on to say that, like, we're accountable to certain communities, certain groups that we view as oppressed,
Mm-hmm.
who feel betrayed when their voices are not taken into consideration.
Right.
And she says that doing that enacts epistemic marginalization. It is to enact epistemic harm. And then she says that the journal is not the offense police, but it is the "have you engaged the relevant literature" police. And given our feminist commitments, we as a journal are in the "make sure we are not enacting marginalization of our own community" police. We fail. And you might think, well, this is just a commitment particular to feminist philosophy. At least this isn't going to be imposed on the discipline as a whole. But she goes on to say, speaking about philosophy more generally, we need to listen and we need to engage. This means that analytic philosophers like me cannot continue to do theorizing about people as we have done until now.
Well.
Yeah, she asks who we should be accountable to,
Mm-hmm.
or I guess whom we should be accountable to.
Right. That's striking. Yeah. Or what strikes me the most, perhaps, is that thinks that some philosophers should be specifically accountable to specific groups of people. This is really, I mean, it's not really a surprise, but to see it stated so bluntly is really striking.
But she should really ask the question, should we be accountable to anyone? And I think this sounds like a conflict of interest, right? Like, imagine if the Journal of Military Ethics had said, well, we're accountable to our men and women in uniform in the U.S. Armed Forces. That would be seen rightly as a conflict of interest.
Yeah.
Imagine Plato's allegory of the cave.
Right.
The person who's trying to lead the people out of the prisoners out of the cave and into the sunlight. Who is that person accountable to? Presumably, philosophers are supposed to be accountable to reason and to argumentation, regardless of who's making those arguments.
I suppose one could make an argument that philosophers should be accountable to everyone, in as much as everyone is capable of, to some extent, engaging with their ideas and their arguments. But to select a specific group of people, this is, yeah. I mean, again, not surprising, but
right,
quite striking. Yeah. Okay, so maybe we can, I don't know, do you think we should add more to our discussion of the Hypatia affair specifically, or that it's time to move on?
Well, I'll say this. A year ago, the only time I met Rebecca Tuvel, she was in Boulder for a public philosophy conference, and she spoke about this whole incident. And I remember that there was a guy in the Q&A, the last person who stood up in the Q&A, and he said, the system is working. Like, literally, he said the system is working. What's the big deal? They didn't retract the article. And I think that shows an extremely narrow understanding of what's at stake here. It's a little bit like saying about the Watergate scandal, well, this was a burglary in which nothing was stolen. What's the big deal? You know, the big deal is the abuse of presidential authority in that case, and the big deal here is academic freedom and an atmosphere where we can freely pursue important ideas without fear of being ostracized, censured, having our careers put at risk, being denounced, that sort of thing. So I think it might be worth reflecting on why this is an important episode to think about.
Okay. So to continue the discussion, we can either discuss these issues more generally. This is what I had prepared, but before we started recording, you mentioned a few other incidents that you have in mind. Do you think we should cover these first and then sort of move to a more general discussion, or?
Yeah, we might as well. I'll mention them just briefly.
Right. Okay.
So there was an episode earlier this year with 3 a.m. magazine. Richard Marshall did an interview with Holly Lawford Smith, a philosopher, I believe at the University of Melbourne. Anyway, she expressed some views to the effect that she wasn't completely convinced that self-identification should be the only criterion that matters for who is a woman and who is not. This caused the whole Twitter social justice mob to mobilize against her and against the magazine, and they pulled the interview. And Richard Marshall, who had been interviewing there for I don't know how many years, quit and started his own blog, the 3:16 a.m. magazine or blog. I'm not sure which it is, but you can find the interview there. And there's nothing about what Lawford Smith says that's particularly inflammatory, unless you just have the view that anything critical of the ideas of the trans rights movement are inherently hateful. So that's one recent episode. There are a couple of others I want to mention briefly. So Justin Weinberg at Daily News posted about an essay on Medium by an anonymous philosopher, somebody who said she was leaving the profession because of the transphobic nature of some philosophers. And this person was basically saying that in order to, you need to make the profession safe for me, and that apparently means removing views that I think threaten my identity from the profession. And this person made a list of demands like Journals need to not referee any papers that include transphobic views. You need to ostracize anyone who expresses them. And Weinberg, in his comments, he was urging his readers to be very, very sympathetic toward this person, and didn't go as far as T philosopher, that's the pseudonym for this person, goes, but he did give his own set of proposals that were extremely one-sided, which was, every time a gender critical piece is published, which is a piece critical of the transgender rights movement, basically, it needs to be paired with something on the other side, or if there's a poster presentation at a conference that expresses gender critical views, then it needs to be accompanied by some sort of warning label. And he seemed pretty clear that philosophers should have the goal of eventually, and probably sooner rather than later, eliminating alternative views from the field, right? And he just spoke about this in the kind of tone that you would talk about a racist uncle at Thanksgiving that you just have to put up with. So there was that. And then more recently, this is in July and August, you had this letter of 12 leading scholars.
Okay.
At the, I think it was published in Inside Higher Ed. And it was just a note saying that these philosophers were concerned about gender critical views not having a place to express their views in the field without feeling ostracized and censured and things like that. And that provoked a number of intemperate responses. And we could go into them now, but we need not.
Okay. I mean, we have time. There's no rush. So if you want, we can discuss that in some more detail. There's no problem.
All right. Well, I'll say a little bit about the responses to this.
Yeah.
So there's a letter of 12 leading scholars, and its tone was just very modest. Like, people should not be censured and ostracized for expressing their views on gender identity. The most temperate and sensible response was posted on the blog of the American Philosophical Association. But it basically says, yes, we agree, nobody should be censured for their views on gender identity, but there's basically no problem here. This is what they say. The nature of sex and gender and the relationship between them are not forbidden topics of philosophical discussion. Many feminists holding significantly different philosophical views have been respectfully debating them for decades. One easy way to see a quick overview of these different positions is by reading the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on feminist metaphysics, or the entry on feminist perspectives on sex and gender. I find that unintentionally hilarious. Like, oh, look, you've got all of these different versions of feminism to choose from. You've got 31 Baskin-Robbins flavors of intersectional feminism to choose from. You've got all the choices you need. And they also say, like, there isn't a problem here. Well, then it's not really clear why you need to respond to the letter. If you just agree that, like, yeah, people shouldn't be censured for their views, I don't see why that would occasion a response. But then they go on and say something really revealing. There are many diverse, contentious views about gender and gender identity that can be and are engaged in ways that do not call into question the integrity and sincerity of trans people, nor the validity of their own understanding of who they are. That's revealing, because they see the limit at trans people's understandings of themselves, right? If you question their understanding of themselves, well, then you've gone too far. But that's basically where all of the action is at, right? That's basically what this controversy is about. It's about questioning those things. So, it actually reminds me of something from the Mormon Church,
Right.
which is there's this sort of parable I was told as a kid. I remember in church. Um, I don't remember the origin, but I think it was some Mormon uh, apostle or official who was a missionary in Africa who observed that there were these goats that were tied up to posts, and that they would always be at the very end of their rope, uh, as far as they could get away from where they were tied to. And this person said, "Well, why are they straining at the edge of the rope? They've got all the grass they need right there. If they would just relax."
Mm-hmm.
And the lesson here is, like, you're not supposed to rebel. If you would just live within the confines we set for you, you could be happy. But it's not a very flattering image, right? Like, you can be a goat on a rope. Like, why would you
Mm-hmm.
need more than 10 feet of space to live in? And it seems to me like
Mm-hmm.
these philosophers are basically saying, well, you've got your 10 feet of intellectual rope that you can move around in. Just don't go beyond that. So that's all I've got to say about that response. There was
Yeah.
another
Yeah.
truly awful response from Professor Mark Lance
Okay.
at of Georgetown University.
Yeah.
This was in the Inside Higher Ed, same place as the original response to the 12 Scholars was published.
Okay.
And he compared debating gender identity in ways that question the identities of trans people as they understand it. He compared that to Cotton Mather debating whether or not Native Americans had souls and whether or not they should be killed. And he has one little proviso where he says, "Oh, I guess these things aren't exactly the same." Yeah, I would say they're not exactly the same, but that doesn't get him very far when the entire paper is set up
Mm-hmm.
on making that analogy. Um, and basically, he says, no, we really need
Right.
to denounce these.
Okay. So these are the two responses that you wanted to cover.
There's a third. There's a third, but
Yeah.
it's more of the same.
All right. All right. Okay. Um, yeah, we can, I think, discuss well, more what you think might be better approaches to these questions. One of the arguments that you've made in several places is that many of the central claims of the trans activists rely on the notion of gender identity. This is a term I think we have used already today. And you argue that this notion of gender identity is not defined very clearly or very satisfactorily, and as a result, the claims that are made on this basis cannot really be very intelligible.
Right. You know who's got really good work
Mm-hmm.
on this is Alex Bern. If you read
Okay.
his essays in Arc Digital on gender identity, it gets very, very hard to see what it is um, beyond this, that it is a feeling.
Mm-hmm.
It is a feeling of being one gender or another, and it is the sole determinant
Mm-hmm.
of whether someone is a man or a woman. Um, it's very hard to say anything substantive
Okay.
about it. Yeah, I think this is a very problematic concept. I don't mean problematic in that way.
Right.
I mean, there are some
Yeah.
philosophical problems, I think, with the notion of gender identity.
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask you this, though. Do you think you have a gender identity? I mean, an internal sense that you are a man that corresponds with your biological sex. Do you think you have that?
That's I was not prepared to think about this question. Um,
So
yeah.
the claim is that
Yes. Yes. Yes.
everyone has a gender identity. Everyone has one.
Yeah.
If you're a cis man, that means
Mm-hmm.
that your gender identity corresponds with your
Right. Yeah.
assigned gender, because they're not
Mm-hmm.
using the word
Sure.
biological sex if they can avoid it, right? So
Mm-hmm.
but you definitely have one. The question is, does it align with your
Yeah.
assigned gender or not?
Uh-huh.
And I've just got to say, I'm going to introspect myself here and say, I can't like introspect to any gender identity that I have. I don't have a feeling
Mm,
that I'm a man. I don't know what that feeling would be. I believe I'm a man because I have a male body, it seems to me, unless I'm a brain in a vat. But I don't.
mhm,
So when somebody says I'm a cis man, that means I have a gender identity and it corresponds to my male body. And it is that, in virtue of that, and not in virtue of my male body, that I am a man. Well, I can't introspect to that.
yeah, I would need to think more about that for myself, but yeah, yeah, I don't um I don't feel ready to answer this. I haven't thought about it so much, or or at all actually. Yeah,
But if the answer isn't definitely yes, I've got one, then it
right,
seems like already
right.
we've got some trouble on our hands here. So when I asked somebody about this recently, the answer I got was, well, if you were
Hmm.
dysphoric, you would know it.
Yeah.
And I think that's definitely true. Um, but the question is, why assume that I'm the one who's having the introspective failure here, right? Am I failing to perceive my own gender identity? Or are the people who are dysphoric misperceiving something? I mean, I think that seems
Hmm.
like it ought to be an open question. If I can be mistaken about my introspection wise about my gender identity, whether I have one or not, it seems like it ought to be possible for other people to be
Hmm.
mistaken about theirs.
Yeah. I mean, could it be that neither is mistaken, but that people for whom the the impression doesn't align with the hardware, so to say, tend to notice it, and people for whom there is no such misalignment don't notice it.
Yeah, that's a possibility. That's a possibility. Yeah, so for me, it might be like what was said about the music of the spheres. It's going on all the time,
Uh-huh.
and so you don't hear it because
Right.
you're always hearing it. You don't notice it. So it could be that my gender identity
Yeah.
is like that, but I'm not sure why I'm forced to
Mm.
take that interpretation, right? Rather than the interpretation that maybe someone else is having
Right. Right. Yeah.
the
Mm.
failure of intuition here.
It's a tough question, and I'm not I'm not knowledgeable enough about this specific question to really give a very strong opinion on it. But yeah, I mean, I understand now. I think better your objection to this notion, because I was sort of under the impression that I need to remember now, but yeah, there are two components, right, to this notion of gender identity. There is the idea that it is, this sense that people have of which gender they are. And the second thing is, it is the sole, it is claimed to be the sole determinant of whether one is male or female, or a man or a woman. And I was sort of under the impression that the first half of the definition is pretty straightforward, but that the latter was well, extremely strong and probably wrong. But okay, now after hearing your question about it, I'm not even sure about the first half of the definition.
It's also difficult to know like what the gender
Hmm.
possibilities are beyond
Right.
male and female, right? Like
Yeah.
once you get beyond the binary to all of these new gender identities, or well, apparently new, right? One could say that they have existed all
Hmm.
along, but they've been suppressed. But how many are there, and how could I know? How could I know without observing anyone else's directly whether I have the same gender
Hmm.
identity as anyone else? How would I know that my gender identity is the gender identity of a man if I had no external reference point about what men are? Or, it's there are some really puzzling epistemic questions here, and I think it puts pressure on the emphasis on lived experience in this domain. And a lot of the pushback against Tuvel with the whole you need to engage the literature, if you dig down deeply into that, you get to the claim pretty quickly, usually, that members of certain communities have really important lived experiences that inform the correct philosophical view of things. Whereas I just think there are general reasons to be suspicious that lived experience of any kind usually helps inform philosophical views about very abstract things. I think it can generate interest in philosophical questions, but I'm skeptical of the notion that lived experience can usefully inform our metaphysical and epistemic views about
Mm-hmm.
very abstract
But
questions.
it's not obvious to me that it's so abstract in this case. I mean, I'm not sure I agree with you that it's really abstract in this case. It's why do you consider it as really abstract?
Well, I can say, this is what I've experienced. This is how I've been treated by other people. This is what people say that makes me feel
Mm-hmm.
bad about myself, and that could be really useful
Yeah.
information to know, right? If we're concerned about the well-being of people and the well-being of people with gender dysphoria, that's
Mm-hmm.
useful to know. But if we're trying to get to the question, um, what is the nature of gender identity? It's just not clear why my experience
Mm-hmm.
helps inform that question, especially given that everyone is supposed to have a gender identity. Um, but I could point to other issues as well where I'm just skeptical that lived
Mm-hmm.
experience is especially useful. I have this essay in Arc Digital called
Mm-hmm.
"Do the Oppressed Really Know Best?" that takes on this notion that people who are in marginalized groups are epistemically privileged in some significant respect with regard to important social issues. I think that can be true, but I see no
Mm-hmm.
reason
Yeah,
to think that it generalizes, right?
yeah, right.
Sometimes the costs of being marginalized and oppressed are that you're epistemically
Mm-hmm.
worse off. You have some sort of false consciousness, or you're full of anger,
Sure.
maybe reasonably full of anger, and that can intrude with your thinking. And it's not
Mm-hmm.
clear that because you're personally invested in a topic
Yeah.
that that's good for your thinking of it, right? Like, in fact, if I have like one of the things that this shows up also in the APA article that
Mm-hmm.
I read some of it for you earlier, where there's some presumption in favor of the views of those who
Mm-hmm.
have skin in the game with regard to a topic. Whereas I think, like, wait a minute, that doesn't having skin in the game mean that you're biased, right?
Right.
If my personal identity is deeply tied up
Mm-hmm.
with some
Mm-hmm.
question, or my sense of identity is deeply tied up with some question, that seems like a reason to think
Yes.
that I might be biased on that question, right? I might be, yeah. So I find it really puzzling, these appeals to personal experience, um, beyond like a merely practical level where they might be relevant. But when we're talking about deep philosophical questions, I'm not so sure.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree with you on what you just said about I mean, the question of epistemic advantage and do less privileged people have such an advantage? I think it's a tough question, and certainly depends on the topic, and certainly is not as simple as often presented by these simplistic ideas of. I fail to remember the catchphrases now, but to listen to the voice of the marginalized people, etc. I think I was just pushing back a little bit on the idea that this is. I mean, yeah, I'm a bit surprised that you call it really an abstract question, this notion of gender identity, and maybe I would link that more broadly to I mean, another question which I could ask, which is, do you think philosophy is really, because we've talked only about philosophy so far, why is philosophy so involved in this debate, whereas one could expect that maybe psychology, biology, and docrinology have at least as much to say on these questions?
Well, it seems to me that many of the questions that are being addressed here are philosophical questions. Like, Um, a trans woman is a woman. That sounds like a metaphysical claim, doesn't it?
Fair enough. Yeah.
And and how do I know that I'm a man?
Mm-hmm.
Do I know that I'm a man because I have the gender identity of a man, or because I have a male body? That's an epistemic question.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And I even think like, do my pronouns, right? Like he, she, do these things track gender, or do they track biological sex? Assuming that these things are different and sometimes come apart. That sounds like a philosophy of language question to me. So I think there are lots of important questions that psychologists can address, but it seems to me like we've got some genuine philosophical questions on the table. And I think people are afraid to explore them. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you look through the literature and you really see the what I would say is the effect of this kind of atmosphere.
Yeah.
Typically, if there's like a tiny interstice in some well-known position,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to see people jump all over it to try to
Right.
get a publication pushing some objection.
Right.
Well, I just raised a number of questions where I don't think that there is like a literature
Mm.
uh, going, really probing all of those questions to the depths, right? I'm sure that there's more out there than I've read,
Mm-hmm.
but there's just not very much out there compared to how contentious the topic is and how many philosophical questions seem to be on the table.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think I see better now why you claim that this whole topic is related to philosophy, or is posing questions that should be of interest to philosophers. Have you noticed any distinction in what you've read made between transgender people and transsexual people? Because this is something I learned maybe 6 months ago approximately, that at least some researchers who are apparently much less ideological than many others, tend to make the distinction between transsexuals and transgender people. The first would be only men that become women, and it very much has to do with the actual sexual attraction to women, and in this case, sexual attraction to the fact of being like a woman, dressing like a woman, etc. There is what is called this autogynephilia. There is this research by Ray Blanchard and others. So that would be the transsexual reality, so to say, and the transgender people would be, more as we think of them in the contemporary uh, sort of debate, where it's all about identity, people who think they are, who feel that they are of the opposite gender that compared to to what their body would indicate. Is it something you've encountered, this distinction? Do you think it's important? Do you think it's some people fail to make it? Or
Well, now we're getting into the realm of empirical psychology,
right?
where I think I'm not qualified to really comment.
Okay. Okay.
I am familiar with that distinction and this
Mm-hmm.
idea that some people who identify as trans, it has to do with their orientation. Uh,
Right.
this is it found in the work of Ray Blanchard and
Yeah.
Alice Drager in her book Galileo's Middle Finger
Exactly.
talks about the hostile backlash he
Yeah.
received and is still receiving on Twitter
Mm-hmm.
on a pretty much a daily basis over this. Um, so I don't know the extent to which that's true. I have encountered the distinction about your earlier question. Have I encountered a difference between transsexual and transgender, like the
Mm-hmm.
usage of the terms generally? I think those might be specialty terms that Blanchard uses, but I don't think they're standard necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
My understanding is that transsexual is an older term and that
Yeah.
transgender is a newer term. Um, so, for one thing, just the term sex
Mm-hmm.
is an older term now, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a strong preference to talk only about gender
Yep.
in these discussions on the trans inclusive side. So they don't talk about your biological sex and your gender identity so much anymore. In fact, you'll be ridiculed if you espouse the outmoded idea that a trans woman is a woman trapped in a man's body or something like that, that's passé and has been for, I don't know, 15 years or something.
Okay.
But people used to talk that way
Yeah.
pretty regularly about this. Now it's the dysphoria is, I guess, a conflict between your assigned gender or gender assigned at birth and your gender identity.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So this is some terminology. In one of your articles, you discuss some of the definitions or the guidelines that were given in the DSM-5, which is the most recent edition of the American Psychological Association's guide to identifying mental illnesses as a criterion for gender dysphoria, which is, the condition that is condition of being transgender, right? They include as a criterion having a strong preference for toys, games, or other activities stereotypically used or engaged in by the other gender. This is just one among other criteria, and you object, so to say, that it would be more prudent probably to assume that children who engage in such non-typical activities are simply members of their biological sex who defy the stereotypes, which makes sense, but I thought maybe you could have been slightly more generous to the DSM-5 because they just give it as one of several criteria. So maybe if it is observed in a child among other symptoms, so to say, then it makes sense to maybe suspect gender dysphoria, but I'm not sure they recommend that on the sole basis of this criterion, gender dysphoria be diagnosed.
That's fair enough. I believe my point was just to emphasize the difficulty in describing what gender is in any substantive terms without referring back to existing gender norms or biological sex. So I think what I said in that article, which is a review of Ryan Anderson's book on this, I believe what I said in that article was I can see how being a man or a woman could be independent of biological sex, and I can see how it could be independent of certain mental qualities, but I have a hard time seeing how it could be independent of each. Now, maybe I should have added social norms as like a third category, right? Just conforming with social norms makes you a man or a woman. You're performing the role of a woman, therefore you are a woman. I think something roughly like that is Sally Haslanger's view, although I've only read secondary literature on this. I haven't read her book, I should say. But I think that's no less problematic for the person who wants to say that we should be entirely gender inclusive, meaning that everyone who identifies as a woman is a woman, no exceptions. I think the cost of trying to be that inclusive, and I understand the generous motive that's behind this, right? Because it seems mean to say somebody, oh, you think you're that, but you're not, so I understand the motive here is a generous one, but I think the cost of being completely gender inclusive is some kind of quietism about what it is to be a man or a woman. Like, it gets very hard to specify what it is.
Fair enough. Yeah. So there is another difficult question, which I think is very recurring in these discussions. Clearly, there is a tension in what one could call social justice activism and also social justice scholarship, because these are very much intertwined. There is a tension that appears more and more clearly, it seems, between, on the one hand, the idea of gender as a social construct, and even sometimes actually it goes so far as viewing sex as a social construct. I mean, you've mentioned the idea of sex assigned at birth. You've used this phrase several times, which is a staple, it seems to me, of some sort of activist scholarship. There's also, of course, the work of Judith Butler, who at some point started claiming that even sex is a social construct that sort of derives sort of in the opposite way as one could guess from gender. So anyway, on the one side, there is this idea of gender as a social construct, right? Something that is sort of imposed onto individuals by the outside environment. And on the other side, there is this completely opposed notion that there is a profoundly individual sense of gender, and that this sense is very much, alive. Certainly, at least in transgender people, but probably in everyone else as well. So these are completely conflicting views, it seems, and yet I wouldn't be surprised if the same people sort of hold them at different times, depending on what cause they have to defend. But in any case, clearly there is a conflict, so probably you'd like to speak to that.
Well, I might actually want to modify my view there.
Mm-hmm.
I've been thinking over the last few days that maybe it's not a conflict. Maybe it's just that there are two
Mm-hmm.
distinct notions of gender that need to be distinguished.
All right.
Maybe that's the view. Um,
Uh-huh.
if that's the view, however, then we return to the
Mm-hmm.
problem of quietism about gender identity being very difficult to define.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or perhaps it's not possible to say anything at all about it, right? So we get back to that problem, but I think that we can define gender in terms of like social roles associated with sex unproblematically. I have no
Mm-hmm.
problem with that definition.
Right.
That clearly
Right.
exists. I just think that when we talk about gender identity, we're talking about something different. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not a contradiction, right? We're just talking about different things, I believe.
I see. I see. Well, that's interesting. It's interesting because it's always tempting to see blatant contradictions in the positions of people one tends to oppose, but it's also important to see if they can be sort of repaired or sort of obliterated or reconciled. Okay, so that's interesting. I should think about it more myself then. Maybe we can move on to the. I mean, I know this is not something that you specialize in, but maybe we can discuss this briefly because it's quite important, I think, in these debates. The phenomenon of desistance, and this is something that concerns people who are diagnosed with gender dysphoria or get involved in these moves towards transitioning at a very early age. So it seems to be quite clear by now, but that a large majority of children who have gender dysphoria tend to grow out of it at adolescence. Many of them turn out to be homosexual, and but this seems to be not on the radar of trans activists who tend to push very firmly transitioning from the moment gender dysphoria is diagnosed. So this can be at a very early age. This can be before puberty. Yeah.
Well, I just want to point out that the word trans youth is very question begging,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, that word tends to encompass all of the children with gender dysphoria.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them, though, might just be gay or lesbian, or just non-conforming to gender stereotypes
Mm-hmm.
and struggling with their identities. But it seems like
Mm-hmm.
that label says, "Oh, this is what it is." They have a misalignment between their gender identity and their assigned gender, and it seems like that's a rush to judgment or a hasty generalization or something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It makes sense. I was just emphasizing the fact that there seems to be a very clear dichotomy between, on the one hand, the data on the on what happens with children who are diagnosed at a young age with gender dysphoria. Namely, most of them tend to grow out of it, and on the other side, there is the activist view that people should be encouraged as soon as possible to transition, and that would entail first maybe to change their names, start dressing differently, then maybe take medication, puberty blockers, maybe at a later age undergo genital surgery. There is clearly a chasm between the data and the activism, as is so often the case. But it's quite striking in this case. And is there any sort of engagement on the part of trans activists with this data, or are they just ignoring it and pushing their view that people just transition?
I may not be as familiar with the data as you are. I have seen some studies cited
Mm-hmm.
that purport to show a majority of children who have gender dysphoria
Mm-hmm.
do desist eventually.
Right, right.
And that's distinct from detransitioning, which is somewhat less common, maybe significantly less common. Actually, yeah, significantly less common, where someone has transitioned in
Mm-hmm.
adulthood and then they transition back.
Yeah.
Um, so I've seen some of these studies. I recall that they all seem to show that most children did desist, but I also recall that they had small sample sizes and
Yeah,
things, and I
that's
don't know
true.
if more recent work has been done. Um, so I don't know if there might be indeed some pushback given just the general replication crisis in
Mm.
some of the social sciences. I wouldn't be shocked um, to be told that there was new data that contested this. So what I do want to say though is this: is if you look at the controversies in other fields
Mm-hmm.
in light of what's happened in philosophy, it's pretty alarming, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I just can't have confidence. So, if the American Psychological Association came out with a statement, maybe they already have. I mean, I don't follow them pretty closely, but let's suppose that tomorrow they came out with a statement that said, um, detransition never happens, those
Mm.
studies were flawed, and we should encourage all trans children to transition. Suppose that were to happen. I have to say, just looking at what's happened in philosophy, I would wonder, is this really the data speaking?
Mm-hmm.
Or has this field also been influenced by political activism,
Right.
right? Are there people in psychology, and I actually have talked to one psychiatrist who said he's afraid to raise certain questions, certain issues with his clients because of the political activism. He's afraid to say that, well, maybe this depression might be due to the hormone pills that they've got you on for transitioning. He's afraid to say that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I can believe that that's true. That rings true to me because I know that there is a similar climate of fear that prevails in philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I've also read publicly available things about like what happened with Kenneth Zucker in Toronto. He's a sex researcher, very pro-trans, but he a few years ago began to be worried that, hey, maybe we should not push the transition thing so quickly for children. And there was this massive backlash, which I believe included um, allegations of sexual harassment and worse, maybe. I think probably even worse than that.
Yeah.
And anyway, you read about this stuff. And then Jesse Singal, who I mentioned earlier, New York Times, he defends Zucker and he gets massive blowback, massive pushback for this.
Yeah.
And I'm just looking at this, and also with Alice Drager's book, where she talks about Ray Blanchard, other researchers,
Mm.
a few other incidents that have come to my attention in fields other than philosophy,
Yeah.
and there's at least reasonable doubt about the science now. If new studies come out
Mm-hmm.
about this issue that seem to incline in the trans inclusive direction, I'm not entirely sure I can just take it at face value because of this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I haven't read Jesse Singal's work as much as I would like. It's something I should find the time to do at some point because it seems very interesting. And just to signal to our audience, I mean, I don't know how many French-speaking people will be listening to this still after well over an hour of interview, but we have a whole episode discussing the book by Alice Drager. Galileo's middle finger in French, and we go into the details of these controversies surrounding the work of Blanchard in particular, and these issues are discussed in quite a bit of detail. So, Spencer, I've reached the end of my questions. Do you think there is something that I failed to push you to talk about?
Oh, there are a number of things I could talk about if you pushed me. I did want to make this one closing point though, which is that I believe that a lot of people on the trans-inclusive side are responding to real moral concerns and a desire to be empathetic and compassionate to other people, and that's praiseworthy. But I think that there is a certain blind spot here. I think that we need to be aware of other sorts of dangers, right? We are aware of sort of dystopian possibilities of extreme sexual repression and this sort of thing, like a Handmaid's Tale. But I think maybe we should consider other dystopian possibilities. Could we imagine a future where autonomy is just run amok and people have limitless self-definition and they have precisely the tools they need scientifically to change their bodies in dramatic ways, not only from male to female and the other way, but into genders no one has even talked about yet? What kind of a future might we have if we just don't question these ideas, right? It's worth questioning where we might be at 10 years, 20 years in the future. And it's worth thinking about the long-term cultural effects of this. Some people seem to think that the whole debate about the transgender rights activism movement is like the war on Christmas or some utterly trivial thing. But I think like the types of issues that we're getting about get to the nature of human identity and the nature of society and how society should be organized and what kind of speech should be allowed. And these are all very real questions, and I don't see them being explored and articulated in a responsible way. And hopefully we've begun to do that here today.
Yes, hopefully. Thanks anyway for doing your best to address these questions today. Thank you, Spencer.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Liberté Académique. We are a science, critical thinking, and freedom podcast. We interview researchers, teachers, and authors who have interesting ideas and who defend free, rational, evidence-based thought. We oppose as best we can a sort of anti-intellectualism coming from a section of the intellectual class. We carry out interviews in English and in French. You can find all our episodes on YouTube and on SoundCloud, as well as on the main podcasting platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, and several others. We are also present on Twitter at @AcadFreedom and also on Facebook.